Okay, this is for chapter 22, section 3. I pull this section out to go with this section on imperialism because while not technically Western Civ, Japan is going to be important later on. But it's important to note that while Europeans are colonizing a lot of Asia and Africa, Japan manages to avoid that. How? They go out and become an imperial power of their own, taking over parts of other parts of Asia. So let's take a look at this, and some of our essential questions are: what effect did the Meiji Restoration have on Japan and their outlooks and goals in modernization? And what steps did they take to become an imperialist nation? So looking at number 1 here, he led the American fleet of warships that sailed into Edo Bay with the goal of opening up Japan to U.S. trade. That is, of course, Matthew Perry, not the one from Friends, this Matthew Perry. Okay, this is his contingent meeting with the representatives of the emperor. Number 2 here, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan for 200 years, and during that time it drove out foreign traders and missionaries, isolating Japan from almost all contact with the rest of the world. That is true. This was the first Tokugawa emperor, and after the restoration, and their goal was to keep foreigners out and foreign influence out, very much the same that China tried to do. Okay. But that's going to change with the Tokugawa shogunate, which lasts until 1868. And this is actually the last Tokugawa emperor. Okay, 6 months after the president's letter was delivered, a larger fleet arrived. We need an answer. Some shogun officials said it would hurt Japan, but others pointed to the United States' military superiority and called for political compromises or concessions. Hey, when guys show up with new steam-powered sailing ships along with armor plating on them and much more powerful cannon, you pay attention. This U.S. president letter requested the opening of foreign relations between Japan and the United States. Understand here that the United States is on a imperialist mission of its own, and called for better treatment of sailors shipwrecked on Japanese islands. They were often executed. Okay, that was Millard Fillmore, and here he is. Number 5 here, when the Choshu troops fired on Western ships in the Strait of Shimonoseki, it clearly demonstrated that the Japanese military could hold off military forces. That's patently false. One ship, the USS Norfolk, the Nevada rather, goes in and destroys 2 ships and also 2 or several, I think about 6 onshore batteries of guns, and clearly a one-sided victory, 1 ship defeating 2 other ships and destroying 6 shore batteries. Oddly enough, interestingly, at least to me, one of the Japanese ships was named the Daniel Webster. Since the Meiji ruler really was controlled by the Sat-Cho rulers, the capital was moved to this city to recognize the real source of political power. That is Edo, which is further up north in Japan. After the defeat of the shogunate, this young emperor became the symbol of a new era of Japan and its efforts to modernize. That's Mitsuhito. Okay. And here he is. You can see much less of a traditional Japanese costume and much more influence here of Western military uniforms of the time period. Okay, these local nobles were stripped of power. Titles to the land were given, and the titles to the land in 1871, but they were made governmental governors of the territory that had formerly been under the control. These were the daimyo. Okay. These guys still were looking like this prior to this things happening, and then they had to modernize in order to keep their, move away from this traditional style of armor and bows and arrows and samurai swords and move towards more modern techniques and fighting. Okay, the new government territories were ruled by governors called these government territories were called prefectures. And this is the map of the prefectures of Japan. Think of this almost like for us, maybe like counties or larger counties. He headed a commission that studied the governments of Great Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. This is Ito Hirobumi. Okay. He's the one who goes and says, hey, what kind of government do we want to set up if we're going to modernize Japan and move away from having a straight emperor to this more militaristic style and become an imperial power? What do we need to do? Who should we model ourselves upon? Okay. So the new constitution was adopted in 1889. It was modeled after the Imperial Germany government, with the most authority given to the executive forces. That is true. Much like in Germany, even if the legislative branch said it didn't want to do something, basically the executive branch could still do what it wanted to do. Okay. And here's an early example of that holding court with the emperor there. Again, notice the uniform is much more European-like, even though women dress that same way. Okay, the new Meiji Constitution created an executive branch, an upper and lower house, and resulted in a government that was both democratic, both in form and in practice. As we said, no, that's not true. Basically, the emperor, who represents the executive branch, gets to kind of do whatever they want to do, and you guys are sort of just backing things up to make the people think everybody's on the same page. Okay, the Meiji government in Japan, promoted industry, and a key feature of this was this industrial development was a close relationship between government and private businesses. That was true. That was true for a long, long time in Japan. It's a little less so, but more so than here in the United States. But until recently, that had been the case. If you're trying to industrialize and you're trying to modernize your country and do all these things, you've got to have this close relationship between the two. They get concessions from the government. They get, monopolies, in other words, to help build things up very rapidly. But then they owe the government a lot of things to help because the government helped them out as well. Okay, the Meiji government in Japan promoted universal education based on the American model of elementary schools, secondary schools, and universities. And this is true. While the government in Japan promoted Western ideas, including fashion, dancing, baseball, that's right, the rights of women did not change and they could not get an education. That is false. Women were allowed to get educations. Japan and China became rivals over Korea, and that rivalry led to a war in 1894 in which Japan destroyed the Chinese fleet at this Manchurian port city. That's Port Arthur. Okay, this is sort of the battle here. You can see the Chinese troops. If you look over here, they've got things like spears and staffs, where these guys have swords and muskets and rifles rather. After the war, Korea was made independent, but Japan soon had a rivalry with Russia over influence in Korea, and that led to strained relationships between the two countries. That is true. Okay, it's eventually going to lead to war. Okay, Japan destroyed the Russian fleet in a surprise attack at the port the Russians took from China in 1898, successfully invaded Manchuria, and even destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet that sailed halfway around the world to attack Japan. And in 1905, humiliating peace, Japan got which two of the following from Russia? They got the southern part of the Sakhalin Peninsula and island and the Longdong Peninsula. And to kind of show you where these are at, here is the Longdong Peninsula. Different spelling between our book. And here's the Sakhalin Island. This is actually a long island. It continues up this way. Moving on here, this essentially stopped Japanese immigration into the United States. That was the Gentleman's Agreement. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which was an act of Congress that kept Chinese people from coming in, even if they had relatives here. The Gentleman's Agreement was made instead of trying to force this upon Japan. We said, hey, if you guys stop immigration on your end, in other words, you don't let them out of Japan, we will make some concessions on our side for Japanese people already live in the United States. And the biggest one of those was allowing them to go to school. And in places like San Francisco, that didn't always go over well. So the American child apparently not happy with the fact that the Japanese student rather can now come to school, Japanese American. The extra credit question was President Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, and Theodore Roosevelt also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. For what actions did Roosevelt win his Peace Prize? That was for, okay, you have your source and credit, grammar, all that good stuff, but that was for ending helping negotiate the ending of the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, and also for negotiation some peace in Mexico as well. Okay, that's 22-3, and I'll be moving on now to the next set of questions. Hope this helped.